really nice chat a little while back about whether violence is justified, and we'd also been chatting back and forth about the concepts we'd discussed and how the conversation went. I think both of us thought we could have probably explored it a bit deeper or in different ways. So we wanted to have another chat. What I'm doing here with this channel is looking to have conversations with people about any of their views and anything that anybody holds to be an important or dear value, and to explore different ways of talking to people. So if that's something you like, make sure you subscribe. Otherwise, feel free to comment below, share your thoughts, feedback on the discussion, thoughts you think James, stuff that James says or that I say. Be kind though, be reasonable, recognize you're talking to another human being. And yeah, that's about it. Now, over to you, James. Do you want to, because I imagine there's many people going to be watching this who didn't watch our first chat. So would you like to introduce yourself a bit?
I don't think I want to introduce myself too much, but yeah, I'm James, and I think that violence is a lot more justified than most people realize. I think like what it really kind of comes down to is, if you ask somebody, is violence justified, we've kind of been indoctrinated to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably a good thing overall, right? But it kind of like lacks the nuance of like how complex conflict resolution is, right?
Right.
So one of the things that I wish I would have said sooner in our last talk is like, if two guys are at a bar and they decide to get in a fight, and they say like, well, let's go outside.
Yeah.
Like that is essentially them granting consent, right?
Sure. Yeah. I like that.
And
that's a good analogy.
Like general protocol for a street fight is like, when somebody goes limp, you stop hitting them. And general protocol for a street fight is like, if there's other people around and you continue to hit somebody after they go unconscious, those people should try to break up that fight.
Right.
And so like if I'm over somebody punching them repeatedly after they've been knocked unconscious, somebody else is now justified to do what they have to do to get me off of them, right?
Okay.
So that's like the defense for someone else kind of thing. And I think like where the nuance is actually in like what we consider consent.
Okay.
And like
so somebody explicitly saying
hyperbolic knowledge.
Go on, sorry. Hyperbolic.
If somebody's only being hyperbolic and they're not actually consenting to violence, like, does it still count as consent, right?
Yeah.
Does wearing a Nazi uniform while walking down Main Street constitute consent? Like, there's nuance in those answers. It's not like a simple yes or no.
Okay. So,
and I wish I had brought all that kind of stuff up earlier.
Yeah, because it's a tricky topic, isn't it? Because some of what you'd said last time was you feel it's okay that somebody tracks down the guy that punched Richard Spencer and prosecutes him, but you also think it's sort of funny or understandable or acceptable. I forget how you put it, that somebody went up and punched him in the head.
Yeah, so I don't think that if he got caught, that he shouldn't be prosecuted for assault and battery,
mm-hmm.
right? Like, if they can catch him, they should prosecute him. But if I knew who he was, I would buy him a beer.
Would you also turn him in?
My reaction.
If the police came to you and said,
I wouldn't turn him in.
Right. Okay. So I guess
I wouldn't fault somebody else for turning him in, but like, no, I wouldn't be the one.
Okay. So I guess the two things to then explore are what constitutes consent, and I guess there's something also to say, what do we mean about justified? Do we mean morally good? Do we mean we want to propagate more of this kind of thing in the world? Yeah, and then there's also a bit about what is violence. So let's go with the consent thing first. When I think I see your point. When you're saying that there's two people in a bar and somebody, makes a comment or something, and the guy goes, let's go outside, and there's a clear indication that both people know that what we're going to do is go outside and throw hands. We don't then turn around at some point and go, we're going to charge that person with assault because it was a sort of mutually agreed upon combat.
unless somebody gets knocked unconscious and continues to get hit.
Right. Okay.
Or vehemently, like if somebody's vehemently like, that's enough, I'm done, and you continue it, now they've withdrawn consent.
Right. Okay.
But as long as both parties are engaged in combat, like that's mutual combat. That's two adults consenting to engage in behavior that, like, the only thing that they should be prosecuted for is maybe disturbing the peace, or if like property is destructed, you know.
Sure. Okay. So, I guess I would want to know where would we consider that line of consent to be? Because I think there are some people, if I said, oh, I think we should be really careful about, you know, who we let into the country, I think there are some people who would say those words amount to violence. That constitutes consent for me to now go punch Harry.
It might be a better question if I didn't like disagree with the state. Like I think border security is like something, again, that has nuance, right?
Yeah, that's like, what I think about all of these.
I think the wall is largely like a monument to stupidity. Like so much of what should be done is just like put a guy in an SUV and have him drive back and forth, you know?
Yeah.
Like if you build a wall and you don't staff it, well, then they build a ladder, right? But like, especially during a pandemic, like you should be able to vet who comes in and out of the country pretty reasonably. Like, I'm not against border security.
Yeah, and I wouldn't think you are, because to me it's also borders. Restrictive immigration policies seem like they make good bedfellows to me with being on the left and wanting strong labour markets. And that is, you want the labour markets to be able to organise and exert their will and sort of get paid properly. And it's hard to do that if you've got an influx of cheap labour. So to me, it makes sense. I wasn't saying it so much to suggest that you would be against border control. It's that I would think that there might be some people, if you were to say this, let's explore the nuance. How would we then split that nuance? How would we know when somebody has consented? I guess we could say if somebody explicitly says, let's go outside and throw hands, where would the line be for you? How would an ordinary person be able to tell when that consent has been granted?
I would seek confirmation. I think the way that it normally happens is there's kind of this like bro pushing match thing, which is crazy because like pushing somebody is assault too. Yeah. Like that's the way it normally plays out. It's like a steady escalation of violence. Sure. But like I would be looking for explicit consent.
Explicit consent. Okay. And so
Let's fight. Yes. Okay.
And would you say that's the same thing, that's how it would work also in this idea of violence being justified in a political arena, that you say, hey, over there, Mr. Fascist, I want to go and throw hands with you. And Mr. Fascist needs to say, yes, I'm a fascist, or yes, I would like for us to throw hands.
Okay. So now we're actually into some nuance. We spent some time talking about the guy walking down the street in the Nazi uniform. He could be a World War II interactor. We should have a conversation with him and see what he's actually about.
Sure.
If you're an actively engaged political activist, especially if you're a public figure, and you're calling for an ethno-state, which would mean displacing people that you don't agree with or applying different rights to a different group of people, that strikes me as at least a call for violence.
Okay.
Now, like, is a call for violence the same as violence? And like my like real line here is like, I'm not super sure that it does, but I'm not going to condemn somebody else for punching that guy in the face.
Okay.
Like I just don't have it in me to judge the person that's trying to defend their way of life when it's being explicitly threatened.
So if somebody's saying, I advocate for an ethno-state, would be implicitly, would that meet your bar for consent when it comes to violence?
Okay, so the example of Richard Spencer saying like, we'll take half the country, we'll divide it down the Mississippi, and like, I don't even care which side. like you can choose which side of the country. Like him saying that's explicit. He's giving consent to punch himself and to get punched in the face.
Okay.
Not necessarily by me, but like he's telling half the country to displace.
Mm-hmm. So that would then meet the bar for he has consented to violence. Would it matter if he said he consented to violence? Would his sort of self would he need to be explicit on that? Because that's usually what we mean by consent, right? The person knows they've consented, or is that not important here? Or has he?
Okay, so I think the way this is being framed is like, what if he has a different definition of violence that doesn't involve punching people in the face?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if he believes that violence is not punching people is punching people in the face, but he doesn't think it's forcing people onto buses to move them across the country, then he's wrong.
Okay. So could we split apart forcing people onto buses and moving them across the country to recommending or asking for that? Or are they the same for you?
Maybe. Like, the thing that's weird about this is we're talking about, like, is him advocating for forcing people onto buses to move across the country the same as thinking it's the same to punch him in the face, like to say like he should get punched in the face for saying that.
Yeah.
Like we're both just talking about it. Neither of us is actually engaged in violence. So like if we disagree, then what exactly do we disagree about? You see what I'm saying? Like both sides are advocating for violence. Neither of them is actually engaging in it, right? So do we wait for people to get rounded up onto buses and moved across the country before we punch somebody in the face?
I mean, if you're asking me my view, yeah, I would wait for there to be explicit violence as I would define violence, which would be, punching people in the face or forcibly moving them. I would say, while it's at the words stage, if you're asking my opinion on it, while it's at the words stage, let's keep it at words. And then it's when that fails that we give up. I think that there is a valid criticism of that, which is at that stage, it might well be too late. They might have tanks and guns and I might not. Yeah.
So what about when words become bills that become laws?
I would say fight that way too.
No, but I'm saying, like, does it become okay to punch people in the face that have that opinion and the legislation is actually being passed?
So perhaps then it would be worth going to the efficacy question, which is it effective to if we recognize that somebody's doing that, if we recognize that somebody is advocating for an ethno-state? Because I could be swayed. Some of this for me is a moral position, and some of this for me is a efficacy thing. And if I could easily, I think, be swayed here if I was convinced that it was effective to go out punching people like Richard Spencer. Because I'm not too sad about it, but I do think there is a question to ask about what happens next. Because when I've asked other people about the sort of where's your evidence that this is an effective thing, people point to a pre-internet era quite often. And I think in a pre-internet era, it's entirely possible that, if you go out with a bunch of billy clubs and wallop all of the fascists, that's quite possibly going to be fascist uprising done. Whereas nowadays, at least what I felt like I was seeing with those escalating tit for tat things that were happening in America, in Charlottesville and not Detroit, where were they happening? At a lot of those university cities in America, it seemed to me to be that the justification from either side came from the behavior of the other side at the previous thing. Well, they're violent, that's why I've got to bring sticks this time. They brought sticks, that's why I bring shields and riot shields and chuck bricks now. And so for me, the question when it comes to efficacy is, do we have a climbing level of violence which is justifying one another, and have we gone away from something that might be more effective?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid critique. So the way I look at it is like, how important is the change that needs to happen, right? What avenues are open for it, right? I think, like, looking at the example of like police brutality, right?
Yeah.
And the way that BLM has taken off, that to say like it escalated so quickly is really kind of silly, because it's been escalating for decades.
Yeah.
But like, part of what's happening is we're just getting more access to the brutality. We're becoming more aware of it. But to say like, if you're trying to change hearts and minds, marching down the street with a picket sign might do it, right? But if like the system is rigged against you and you reach a point of desperation, like, we all have a right to defend ourselves, and I think that applies to the collective also, right? So like, a lot of what made Martin Luther King so effective was that there was a counter narrative that like we could just use violence. Like, how much of the civil rights movement was actually, like, where did the progress actually happen? And we talk about MLK, like that's the side that we want to lift up. But would MLK have been effective without Malcolm X?
Right, I see. So he's saying, here's what we want. We want, the I have a dream idea, and then there's only because there's this threat of the fist in the other hand in the form of Malcolm X that people are forced to listen to MLK. Is that the idea?
I think that's what happened.
Okay.
I'm not sure that that's actually like, so like with BLM, a lot of the rhetoric about it is like, well, these guys are burning down cities, and these guys are burning businesses, and these guys are burning like the police stations. I might actually agree with, but like, I don't think Black Lives Matter's mission is to go redistribute wealth by raiding local shops, right? So I would differentiate between like the rioters and the protesters. But there's something about the rioters, and we talked about this a little bit last time, where it's like, I'm not even sure that I want to condemn the person that engages in a riot, because like, they got pushed to the point of believing that like violence was their solution. It can be their fault that they're resorting to violence, but it's not their fault that they got pushed into that position.
Right.
Where the system had otherwise failed them.
Yeah. Yeah, so they get to a point, you're saying, where they feel like that's their only option, and that's stuff that's outside of them. So you might hold them responsible for what they did next, but there is a sort of history behind that leads to that point, and a sort of not being listened to as well, I imagine. Not having these injustices redressed.
And if somebody raids and burns down a shop, like, of course, go prosecute them. Like, I'm not saying that what they did is so valid that they should be above, criminal justice. I'm just saying, I'm not sure that I have it in me to condemn that person.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I would. I guess the question might be, I'm not sure I would condemn that person. I think I would find it perfectly understandable. I think where I get stuck is the efficacy thing, which is not so much with Black Lives Matter, because I think that's already something that gets out of control, and I also think there could be a place where you might say that's effective, to go, look, sort this out, or we're going to burn stuff. Yeah, I think I agree with you there.
And like, as heartless as it sounds to frame it this way, well, the framing is the part that I want to point out, actually. Like, I'm not excited about burning down police stations, but I would rather see police stations burn down than local businesses, right? Like
yeah,
attack
the local businesses
power,
bit.
like where it sits.
attack
But
the
I'm not
power
even
where it
sure
sits,
that
sorry.
those are like actually so much of that could just be opportunism. Like I'm not even sure that those things are necessarily related, because like a lot of the looting that we saw,
Mm.
and it's not to say that there's not Black Lives Matter members that are white, but like there was a lot of white people looting.
Right. So
It
you
was
think
the
it's
same way back in 1990 with, you know,
I'm losing bits of you, sorry.
with the Rodney King
Right. Okay. So the Rodney King riots.
the
also
Rodney King
resulted in that.
riots.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just black people that were looting back then either.
Yeah. So from what you're saying, it's sort of understandable, or you don't have it in you to condemn those people. And yeah, so if we weren't talking about condemning, but I would more say, what about if we looked at the other side of it? Would we actively encourage it? And that's where I more look at the efficacy thing, which is there the chance that if we encourage it, even by sort of going, what a legend, you know, when somebody goes and punches somebody, that somebody else will hear that and go, awesome, this is my way to make a difference in the world. This is me living up to my life's purpose. And that is, I'm going to go find a terrible person who's doing something bad that I perceive to be bad, and go and then whop them in the face. Because, like, to go back to your two people in a bar analogy, I worry that if there's nuance in whether somebody consents, so if it's like, because some people would say in that bar analogy that turning around to somebody else's girlfriend and making a lewd comment would be implicit consent to throw hands with her boyfriend, whereas other people would say, no, it's not. And some of what I would worry about encouraging that kind of thing, or sort of condoning it or celebrating it, would be that you end up regularly finding that going to a bar turns into an all-out brawl because one person starts with the violence, and then as you're talking about, more and more people go, well, now it's my job to step in, and now with this, and then suddenly there's, you know, sort of those scenes from movies, you know, where everybody's chucking bottles and dragging people down the bar and smashing balsa wood chairs over one another's heads. Like, so is there a risk that encouraging it begets more violence, I guess?
I've been a bouncer, and that's just like never how it plays out. Like,
yes, yeah, I'm
every venue caters.
Say again.
Every venue caters. Every single venue like that exists that serves alcohol caters to a demographic, and most of those demographics are pretty agreeable and can kind of get along with each other. But the ones that can't are exclusive. Like, this is a biker bar. It belongs to this club. You know, if you're an outsider, you pay homage, kind of thing. There's a lot of like very conservative Trump-looking bars where if you're a liberal, you just don't get to talk. Like, if you're going to go in there, you're just not going to talk, right?
So do people stand around in them like talking about Trump?
A bar that had one side.
Sorry, go on.
I'm sure they do, but like, you're not going to see a bar where one side is painted red and the other side is painted blue, and they're shouting at each other. Like, that's just not the way that environment works. Like, maybe that analogy could be extended out into like how societies operate, right? But like, it's been my experience that, my understanding of the demographics is that most of the nation is a lot more purple than we give it credit for. Like, the rates of like conservatives versus liberals are much closer to equal than we realize. They're just much more liberal in population centers. Yeah. So like that's like why it like balances out. Like, anyway, that was quite the tangent. I apologize.
Yes, and I didn't mean to be getting into the like using the bar analogy too literally. I just more meant, I think what I felt like what I was seeing when I was watching YouTube footage and newscasts from America, and to an extent in Australia and as well it was happening, was that with this idea that seemed to come a bit more from the left, I would say, that words equal violence, that silence is violence and things like that, that because there were encouragements to commit violence, that seemed to justify violence on the other side. So it seemed like what we were saying initially was like Antifa turning up and then a few hands would get thrown, and then by the next one, a bunch of the Trump supporters have come with like garbage bin lids and sticks and stuff, until we had that, like, I don't know if you saw that phenomenon of the based stick man, you know, this guy that like sort of dressed like a sort of budget shop Captain America, and was like going around with I think he would go in there with a flag, but use the flagpole to wallop people, and became a sort of internet phenomenon from sort of him and his, you know, the Proud Boys or the Boogaloo Boys, and who would go there to beat up Antifa people. And I wonder if that, because when it comes to efficacy, I think the point you make about the purple states is really important, which is we are much more nuanced in our views. And there is a theory in psychology called terror management theory, which is this idea that we are moderate. Well, we become less moderate with exposure to violence or risks. So if we start to feel like my body, I might be physically under threat from something, which doesn't have to be a real threat, could just be somebody showing you a clip of it on the news, that will make people's views more extreme. And they've done a few experiments that seem to support this theory. And so some of when it gets to the efficacy point is, I'm wondering, does condoning violence on either side actually push people away from that purple thing and towards these bright red, bright blue extremes?
Okay, so I think the point that I'm making is probably more a criticism of like my fellow leftists that are like against violence. They're just like, violence is never justified, right? Because I think conservatives understand that violence can be justified better than liberals do. And I forget the name of the guy, but the cattle rancher that like set up shop on federal land with a bunch of like Republicans and rifles, and
yes,
we're like, we're gonna stay here until our demands are met.
Bundy or something.
If you look at the way that was reported on, yeah, that's it, Bundy. The other Bundy. If you look at the way that was reported by conservative media, that they get it. They're like, you know, fuck the feds, and these guys are patriots, and they're, you know, God-fearing Americans, and so like they get it when they. I'm not even sure how much they actually agreed with it. They just said, we identify with these people, therefore they're justified, right? And I realize that's a little bit of a straw man, because it was certainly reported differently by not conservative media, which we can call liberal if we want to. I would say like media that's more interested in fact reporting instead of liberal media most of the time. This is just a quick tangent.
Yeah.
The Young Turks is like a YouTube liberal media channel, and they spend a lot of time talking about like Justice Democrats, which are like, those are my favorite people, like the Squad, right? And like I agree with them about like being against corporate Democrats, and like they're great, right? They do really good reporting. But if you watch my watch history from their channel, I consistently watch like either the first half or the first 2 minutes of their videos, because once they do the breakdown and start getting like all dramatic and hyperbolic and just like shouting at the camera, I'm like, I'm not in it anymore. Like, I appreciate that you reported on the story that mainstream media is not talking about, but now I really don't care about your, like, they get so frenzied, you know? So I can make criticisms of my fellows as well. It can be quite silly. I took quite a tangent there. I hope you had notes on what direction we were trying to go.
Well, I wanted to ask because some of my interests, like I'm saying, is the efficacy. Is this going to work? And so I think there's that risk when it becomes hyperbolic media, which I certainly would agree. I think the right was doing for a long time. I feel like I noticed the more left-leaning media doing it. Maybe not so much now. But that sort of quite often slippery slope style reporting of like, oh, this is just the start, and next they're going to want da-da-da. And that to me, I think, is effective if you want to whip people up and agree with you. I think that I guess the question of efficacy always is, what's the actual question? What are you trying to measure? What are you trying to achieve? And I'm curious because for a few things. Firstly, because I hold a fairly staunch view that this is a good way to change people's minds, and that is sort of finding that room, that space where you agree, where you've got good rapport, and discuss things. But at the same time, we had a conversation because you said you used to be quite right wing, right?
Very, yeah.
When you say very, do you want to go into like how very we're looking?
Well, okay, so like all of these individual pieces on their own wouldn't necessarily constitute somebody like being a white nationalist, right?
Right.
But like collectively, I look at it and I'm like, I'm pretty sure I was either a white nationalist or very near to actually qualifying as one.
Okay.
So I'll start by saying like Fox News was just always on.
Okay.
Like the TV lived for Fox News. If Dad was in the backyard doing yard work, it was Rush Limbaugh or something of that nature, right?
Yeah.
I slept with a Virginia regular flag over my bed.
Virginia regular flag. Am I going to Google that and find it looks very much like a Confederate flag?
So it's the one that's normally referred to as the Confederate flag, but it's not actually the flag of the Confederacy. And this is a really fun point. If you want to be a under the radar white nationalist, you find the actual Confederate flag and you fly that because
Right.
nobody knows what it is, right? But so to kind of like look at like the way that I perceived those facts, what I would have called facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a little bit last time about like Confederacy maybe being like my ideal form of government, like the strongest government should be local. Like I really believe that stuff, right? And I still think the strongest government should be local government. So like that was my like real attraction to that as a symbol. And if somebody said like that's a racist hate symbol, I was like, you're out of your mind. Like it's not even close to what I'm about. But with that said, there was definitely a narrative in the home that I grew up in that the American experience, the you can be born at any level and rise to the top, and the white picket fence with the wife and 2 kids in a 2-car garage, like that experience was intended for white Americans.
Oh, okay.
Like that was a prevailing narrative. And if you were not white, and even if you were like a first immigration immigrant, the narrative that I grew up with was that we were kind of happy you were here and we hoped that you like did well for yourself, right?
Right.
But like you're a little bit of an outsider.
Right.
Like the American dream isn't really for you. So stop trying to acquire the American dream. Like
so you can do well, but you're going to be bringing me my groceries and cleaning my car and stuff, not living next door to me with a white picket fence.
And like, it's not even to say that like immigrants weren't welcome in our neighborhoods. Like I grew up on a street that I had a Chinese guy across the street. I had an Iranian neighbor. We had a Korean family. It was very diverse, right? But like, as far as like what the neighborhood like actually was, I've also lived in communities where mariachi music is just always playing, just all the time, like very Central and South American immigrant dominated areas. Like I've lived in those neighborhoods, and like my father hated that.
Did
like
he?
it really got under his skin. So he was happy to have immigrants around,
right,
and be successful and do jobs that like us true blooded white Americans don't want to do, right? But like America's going to stay waspy. So like that's what I grew up with, and there was no like we weren't like advocating for an ethno state or anything crazy like that, but just to kind of like fast forward into part of how I got out of this.
Yeah,
somebody
that's exactly
like
what
sat
I want
down
to
with
hear.
me. somebody, I was wearing like a Virginia regular bandana at a camp. A bunch of friends went out to the river to get drunk for a weekend, and somebody that was like progressively minded confronted me about it.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, we're not really about that. And then they like kept their distance from me. And after like a day, she's like, James, like, you're a pretty cool guy. Like, can we talk about the headscarf, right? And I think she took a full year to like really figure out what I was about, and came back the next year, a year later, with like a copy of the Confederate Constitution, and where like slavery is explicitly protected by their Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And like really had like that compassionate conversation with me about like, this is why this is a symbol of hate. This is why this symbol doesn't mean what you think it means, right? And
how
I got home from that camping trip and I took the flag down from over my bed.
Wow.
So like that worked.
So can we rewind just to before the camping trip? How would you, like, because you're obviously at that stage hanging out with liberal people, was that a fairly constant, or was that something you sort of evolved into as a sort of coming of age thing, or?
I would say that I kind of got adopted into a group that saw something in me that was like more than the persona that I was kind of coming from. I started working in a grocery store with a guy that I perceived as white, who was actually like, he actually had a Hispanic father, and we got along really well. And like when he communicated with me, he was able to do it in like an almost SC format kind of way. Like so many of the things that have like really revolutionized the way I think, I look back on and I'm like, SC was a thing before it was a thing.
Yeah.
So I'm really passionate about this project, but like the movement of street epistemology, I think it's made like great improvements.
Okay.
In my thinking.
So you'd started having these SE style, this street epistemology style questions with this guy you worked with, and then you get adopted by this group, and was it really like that? Like that sounds like a fairly night and day, like bang, that's it, I'm going home and I'm taking down the Confederate flag. How it usually takes a bit longer, like to talk us through how much of that was a process of change, or like how much changed just with taking down the flag? Like I imagine there's stuff with the family still to go there. What's Thanksgiving like?
Yeah, I worked with that guy for at least 6 months, probably a year, before I got invited to the river. Okay. And I think it was like the second river trip where that first interaction happened. So I was friends with him for a good 3.5 years before I took the flag down.
Okay.
But he was also like able to be friends with a white guy that had a Confederate flag over his bed. So like, I don't know if that bodes well or bad for him, but I'm glad it happened.
So yeah, so then you get home, you take down the Confederate flag. Is there a moment with your family? Do you sort of have to come out as not a, or have an explanation as to why you no longer wear your Virginia regulars bandana, or?
Okay, so another friend that I made years later really kind of challenged a lot of the ways I thought, and I found myself really admiring the way that he thought about things. And he was probably the one that like walked me out of my theism, or like my Christian theism anyway. I ended up being a Nordic polytheist for another decade after this, but like
I can see you do have an aesthetic of a Norseman. That's sort of, I can imagine you getting off a ship
that I've fallen into,
axe in hand. Yep, carry on. Sorry.
He kind of walked me out of my theism and my Christian theism, and that was the central framework for like how I perceived reality, right?
Right.
Like I was, I've had psychosis my whole life, so like I've always felt like spiritual beliefs were like more valid for me than
Sure.
for people that don't have like actual experience of the spirit world, right?
So what is psychosis like?
And
You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, sorry.
no, I'm happy to. Are you asking what it's like today, or do you want like a really dramatic example from my youth?
If you want to share a dramatic example, that would. I mean, I don't want you to disclose. Feel that you're like, come on, give me your bad stuff. But it sounds because I can imagine psychosis doing exactly as you said. You're like, oh, you go to church and stuff, but psychosis, at least for me as an outsider and not a psychologist, it sounds like no. I feel God. I speak to God. I have sort of
Right. Yeah, so I'm actually a really big fan of being able to talk about this stuff because I really want to like help normalize these mental health issues, and skepticism is like the thing that improved my mental health really dramatically. So like the reason I joined the Discord server is to advocate for skepticism as a mental health tool. And what that comes down to is like when you realize that you cannot trust your own experience and the value of verification and like outside confirmation, it really radically changes just like how you perceive the world, right? And like we hang out in the flat earth servers, and I feel like, do you remember the white and gold versus the black and blue dress?
yes.
So like, is that a matter of opinion? Like, no, right? Because like the person either sees it one way or the other. I think a lot of flat earthers see the shape of the world in that kind of a context.
Yeah.
Of like, this is just the way that I perceive the world. And for them, it's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of perspective.
Yeah, right.
And it's like matters of perspective are different than matters of fact. And that's kind of where the nuance here comes with psychosis, is like, just because I experienced something does not mean that it actually happened. It just means that I had an experience of it. So I want to start out with something super mundane because it's like easier to talk about.
Sure.
I work nights. I have a caffeine heavy diet, which is probably part of the reason that I deal with psychosis more than I probably should. But I was driving to work, and I was sure that there was somebody sitting in my back seat, and freaked me out. And like I got the shakes, and I had to pull over, and I had to like physically check behind me to like see that there was nobody there. And then I got on the freeway, and I thought there was like a shadow man in my back seat, and like that like really messed me up. So I'm on the freeway, I'm trying to drive the speed limit, and I think there's like, and I'm a skeptic now, so I know it's not really there, right? And that's like where the trick is here, where I'm like, I am seeing a shadow figure in my back seat.
When you say seeing,
also,
you're like you can see them.
No, that's not there. Well, I don't think there's actual them there, right?
Right.
But like I see something. My visual perception fills in the gaps and tells me that there's a shadow figure in the back seat.
Wow,
where somebody else would not have, like their brain doesn't make those leaps to try to fill in the gaps.
Right.
And the further I get myself from the theistic framework for reality, the easier it is for me to recognize that those things aren't actually there.
I have wondered that, actually. How do you tell somebody that there's definitely not a demon there if their framework of their world, they were just down agreeing with the whole community that demonic possession is real? That would be, I have wondered that relationship. Interesting. Wow.
And then you put one person in that congregation that actually deals with psychosis, and you've developed this like structure around. They implement their psychosis with that framework for reality. And this isn't me like making fun of people that are delusional, because I'm one of them, right? I have like radical sympathy for these people. I'll tell one. I'll try to make it quick. More dramatic story. I was walking home after walking home a friend from like an evening youth group church service where we did all the praise and worship and all the Bible study and all the stuff. And me like being able to see and like combating demons was just kind of like part of how I navigated life back then. I would like cast demons out of trees, and like I had this belief that there was this big tree in the neighborhood where demons kind of set up shop, and that was kind of their center of operations.
Wow.
And it was kind of between both of our homes. So I walked her home, and then as I was making my way to my home, this like, it looks a lot like the in like in Islam. The kind of like
the witch in Islam. Sorry, it just cut out when you were saying
like
that.
If you can. So jinn, the Islamic idea of a jinn.
Okay. I have to find that too.
It's like a torso on top and a V at the bottom. You can kind of just think of the genie from Aladdin if you have to.
Okay, yep.
But like a dark figure.
Sure, yep.
So this, and I didn't know that that's how Muslims described these things, or our mutual experience of these things. But this thing like rose up in front of me, and then it like shot down at me. And what I perceived was that it like was choking me, and I like collapsed onto like my hands and knees, and I was being choked, and then I was able to like whisper the name of Jesus, and it let go of me, and I walked home, right? So here's what I think actually happened. My framework for reality had all these demons and shit in it.
Mm.
I think what happened is a cloud of gnats rose up in front of me. I had a panic attack. I swallowed a gnat. I collapsed. I was able to clear the gnat from my throat by whimpering Jesus.
Mm.
And then I was able to breathe again. And of course that remained like a traumatic experience. You know, it took me a decade to realize that that was probably what happened.
Wow.
Like I lived with that experience as an affirmation of my faith for at least a decade.
Wow.
And I even talked to my dad about it right after it happened, and he was like, "It's probably gnats," which, like, thank God he put that in my head. Thank God
Yeah.
he put that in my head, because like I don't know how that would have manifested if like I'd never talked to him, or like my dad was super religious, but he wasn't into the occult woo type stuff. He was a much more traditional biblically grounded Christian.
Yeah, right.
Whereas I was very into the supernatural stuff. So yeah, that's the examples of how bad it was and how mundane it is today.
That's super interesting. That's a very interesting insight. Thanks, James. That's a great description too, because I would usually say I've got no idea what it must be like, but I do feel that gave me an idea of what it must be like, my guess is those experiences, that's not just a constant you're living with, but that's things sort of flare up maybe a couple of times on a day and then go for weeks without, or was that sort of instances like that fairly regular?
I would say that I could like put on or take off the God glasses that kind of like let me see into that world, right? Mm. And then I probably had like a pretty overactive imagination. Mm. That kind of like filled in those gaps. But the example of being attacked by a jinn is probably more on par with like being in a heightened state, right, where like your brain is spending a lot of times processing emotions and isn't spending a whole lot of time processing visual facts. And like if I am going through trauma today, there's a higher likelihood that I'm going to deal with some psychosis during those heightened states. Like my wedding was amazing. Mm. And I'm pretty sure I had a couple psychosis events that day. But they were great. They were like really positive.
Good psychosis. I didn't even know.
And then
it's interesting.
And then I've had like some negative things happen in my life since then, and like the negative psychosis events are more likely when I have bad stuff going on.
Right. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that you feel that street epistemology, or this sort of this style of Socratic inquiry and the importance of testing to know what's right has helped you move away from that theistic position and away from, and sort of moderate or help yourself manage those psychosis episodes. And it also sounds like something similar to that has worked when it came to this person talking to you on this trip, the camping trip to the river, has worked with changing your views away from what you say is like sounds like close to a white nationalist. That would be my encouragement. Then I would then say that would be my encouragement rather than go punch that Nazi. It's like maybe ask him to take off the armband and then go, can we go have a chat about these views and where you get them? Can we discuss and explore how you hold that to be so true?
Yeah, and I think we reached that conclusion already last time. I said, 60% compassion, 30% ridicule, 10% dread of getting punched in the face. And I agree that the biggest deficit is in the compassion. We're probably in like what we probably actually do is like 80% ridicule.
Yeah.
15% compassion, 5% dread of getting punched in the face, and like that's totally out of balance. Dude, you're absolutely right. The compassionate listening is where the deficit is. And I would have that conversation. I would be the one to walk up to the white nationalist and try to have a conversation. I'd do it when we have Pride here.
Yeah.
When we have our big gay Pride celebration. The protesters that are busy telling people that they're going to hell.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I go up and I talk to them, and like I'm not changing hearts and minds, but what I am achieving is instead of yelling at someone else, they're just talking to me.
Yeah.
So it makes the environment much more pleasant because they're distracted from yelling at people.
Yeah. That sounds great. That's where I'd be going with it. I think it sounds to me like that's really effective. And the thing that I often come back to is time and again, that sounds like that's effective, not just with your stories. I'm also thinking of that guy, Daryl, what's his name? Who is really good at, he's got a wardrobe full of Ku Klux Klansman's robes where he goes, he's a black man. I think,
a legend.
Yeah, and he goes and he talks to them and he says it takes a long time and a lot of discussion, but he talks people out of being cluckers and then says, as a final step, can you give me a rope so I can hang it with the others in the cupboard? And yeah, that's what he says as well. It's like that compassion. It sounds a lot like using questions. Articles I've read of him, he describes that a lot. It's a lot about questions. So quite possibly some of this same street epistemology style Socratic investigation. I don't
think he's ever actually asked somebody for their robe. I think that started with somebody saying like, I don't want to burn it. Will you take it?
Oh, really?
Like somebody offered it to him as a trophy. And like now when he continues to talk to people, the closest he gets to actually saying like, you're going to give me your robe someday is like, I hope to add your robe to my collection. But I don't think he ever actually asked for anybody's robe. But yeah, he does have a whole collection of robes and white lace Doc Martens, and he's a legend. I followed him quite a bit too.
Yeah. So that's an interesting.
Here's the thing. We're gonna do the violence thing, right? So when we're talking about systemic change in a society, we don't have nuanced, thought-provoking, compassionate conversations. We have sound bites, right? Like, there's so many politicians that don't even do town halls. All like a 3-minute answer to a 20-second question. Like, they can't even do that. Everything is reduced to sound bites, right? And then you have these systems that are just really resilient to change. Like, conservatives are really good at being anti-union. Police unions are insanely powerful. How is that not a problem, right? Like, I don't want to get like caught up in whataboutism here, right? But like, I'm very suspicious that these unions have decided to put gag orders on good cops, because I can't reconcile how few cops have spoken out about the changes that need to happen. Like, I don't think all cops are bad, but I do think good cops are being silenced. And like, I think part of the solution is making their life more difficult. Like, just make their life more difficult, make them hate the job, so that they recognize, like, my job will be easier when I give in to these demands that need to happen. Like, the qualified immunity, like, needs to happen.
Yeah.
Ending qualified immunity.
So making their job more difficult, I guess some of my thought would be, could we test the opposite? What about if we made their job easier by, for example, using some of the tools we talk about for de-escalation? You know, you deal with somebody, because I mean, your story would be particularly present for them, because a large amount of the problems, at least that I see with policing, is that it is performing a mental health function in society, and to give them training in terms of mental health so that they could talk somebody down from a sort of dangerous psychotic state to something where they can sort of go, oh, that's all right, I'll go inside and I'll sleep it off, could make their job easier so they don't have to lock that person up and get engaged, get punched by somebody and then punch him back and then go home and feel guilty about that and then suffer with the sunk cost bias, the escalation of commitment. Like, I was right to punch him. There's no other way to get through to these people. I think if we made their jobs easier, still I would agree, increase the risk. Some of what you're talking about, that qualified immunity, is, I think, increase the risk for wrongdoing. I would question, or would you also take the other side of, like, make it a lot easier to do the right thing?
Okay, did you watch the video I recommended with Harris and Gracie talking about how to implement jiu-jitsu training into law enforcement?
Yes, I did. I think I did. Anyway,
so one of the things, just for anybody else that watches this and doesn't know what I'm talking about, one of the things that they both talk about, you got a neurologist and a jiu-jitsu specialist talk about, is the amygdala hijack, right?
I didn't watch this, but
your amygdala gets hijacked, you lose your higher processing skills, and you get stuck in, like, this is how I have to behave right now. This is the thing that where fighters get nervous about, like, needing somebody to break up the fight. And, like, even street fights, often there's at least one blow thrown after the person goes limp, right? Yeah. Because our amygdala gets hijacked and we lose those higher reasoning faculties. I'm really nervous. I'm really suspicious that Derek Chauvin had his amygdala hijacked, and, like, by the time he was able to realize that George Floyd was dead, he had lost his higher processing ability to do anything about it. And, like, whether or not Derek is innocent or guilty is kind of besides the point for me, because, like, the change that actually needs to happen is less about prosecuting one bad cop and more about changing the actual system. So the thing you do to make cops' jobs better, the way you improve their experience with work, is to condition their brains to not have their amygdala hijacked.
Sure, yeah.
And we could even argue this from a point of, like advocating for autonomy. Like, do you want to lose your higher reasoning abilities when you're in conflict with somebody? Because the more time you spend rolling, the less foreign it becomes. I haven't been in a fight in so long that like, if I got punched in the face today, I have no idea how I would react to it. But
well,
there was
you're talking about
fights all the time.
So yeah, when you say you're in fights all the time, like, how common a thing was that for you?
Okay, this is a really good opportunity for me to disclose something else. When I said that I would have a beer with the guy that punched Richard Spencer last time, that's actually not true. I've been sober for a little over 6.5 years, and, like, the last time I got in a fight was the Tuesday before I got sober.
Right.
But, like, yeah, fighting was super normal back then. Like, I went to my first recovery meeting with scabs and bruises all over me, and like I didn't even lose that fight. I just had like a good tumble, you know.
Right.
Yeah, I used to get in a lot of fights.
Okay. Maybe that's why you advocate for it, because you're like, if we do fighting, I am there for you. I'm going to be good at it. Maybe that's why I advocate against it, because I like any time I've been in a fight, I just get punched while still talking, and I keep talking after I get punched.
I have no interest in getting swung at today because I have no idea how I would react to it today. Like I was desensitized to it. I know what it is to be desensitized to it. I think law enforcement should be largely desensitized to threats of violence. They work in a violent job. Why would they not condition themselves to deal with those environments? It seems like definitely. A lot of the conditioning that's happening in law enforcement is about them maintaining their authority over a situation.
Yes, yeah.
And like, okay, like, yes, some of that needs to happen, but also you work in a violent, conflict-ridden world. Like, you should be a little more capable of dealing with conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I like getting to as well, and that is a point upon which not just we agree, but I think any rational person listening to us would go, yeah, I'd like that too. Because that's where I think there's good ground to be made, that you could have fairly, staunch conservatives and people who fly those police lives matter flags going like, I agree that we too would like better help managing those situations. Because there'll be some cops, I imagine, who go, wow, there's just no getting through to some people. It's just, I don't think you would get as much ground making their job difficult as much as making all of the cops around them, their life that much easier, that it just becomes a little bit, almost an untenable position for them to hold, where they're like, well, I keep having these use of force investigations or sort of inquiries against me, and these guys just keep getting back to talking people down. I think there's also a bit there about how do you incentivize the police force? Because if you incentivize them for arrests, they'll go and scoop everybody up. Whereas if you go, I want to incentivize you based on how peaceful the society is and how much we thrive, how do you measure it? But if you could, I think we'd get very different results from them.
Well, the work that Gracie's done already with law enforcement institutions across the country has shown that paying officers to do jiu-jitsu results in a drastic net loss in cost. So that they're saving money by doing jiu-jitsu training, and there's fewer injuries. There's fewer deaths. There's fewer. Like, how is that a problem?
I like that, because your suggestion
was... I'm sorry that I need you to go train for an hour a week, but it's just not that much. Like, make it... A lot of cops make good money. It may seem really inconvenient, but, like, you're getting paid enough to do an hour of training a week.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a great idea. I think it's a really good idea. Excellent. All right, it's gotten to a nice point there. So what are I like asking, as we did last time, the so what question, and that is for somebody, there's been somebody who's been here, maybe it's 1 in 1 out or something, but somebody's been sitting here watching the whole thing. For somebody watching this now or later, what's the kind of point you would like them to take away, the thing you would like them to learn? I remember last time you said to sort of understand and get involved in local politics, understand what their local politicians stand for and their platforms, get engaged in that. What would you say now for this chat?
That question kind of took me by surprise last time, because I'm not really advocating for everybody to think the way I do. And I think that's really rare. There's not a lot of people that want people to have their own thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, man. Maybe just change the channel once in a while. Like, if you're gonna watch 4 hours of Fox News, go ahead and actually watch Rachel Maddow and just see what she reports on for an hour and the way information is portrayed differently. And if the only thing you get out of it is I disagree with everything they're saying, that can still give you the insight of this is the frame of reference that they're viewing the world from.
Yeah.
This person sees the dress a different color, right? Liberals don't want to destroy America. Liberals want America to rise to its own ethos. Trying to make the notion that all men are created equal real is not trying to destroy America. It's trying to get America to live up to its, let's call it, jargon.
Yeah, nicely said. I think it's also, I think nicely said. The reason I was thinking nicely said was to link it back to all men are created equal is a sort of, persuasive or thoughtful way to put it. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time again, James. And that was really interesting. The stuff you shared about yourself was really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. And sort of everything from what you were talking about with psychosis to your journey from where you were to how you got here, I think is interesting, and it's informative, and it's also given me pause where I am not sure where I'm at with the idea of the violence thing, because I'm still asking that. Well, but what is interesting is it started to make me question a bit that idea of efficacy when you say, well, look, I did have these conversations with this guy I worked with or this girl at the camping, but there's also inherent within it was the ridicule or the threat of getting punched in the face. So I'm going to have to think further on that one, I think. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, James.
Yeah,
thanks for pinging me the message. Go on, what were you going to say?
I definitely wouldn't apply those percentages to just anybody that disagrees with you, right? Like we don't punch people in the face that aren't advocating for violence themselves.
Yeah, right. Yes, true.
Right. Consent has to be part of that conversation or that action. All right, man. I always enjoy listening to